The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 19. The Curve of the Rational Age. The present age of mankind may be characterized from this point of view of a graded psychological evolution of the race as a more and more rapidly accelerated attempt to discover and work out the right principle and secure foundations of a rational system of society. It has been an age of progress, but progress is of two kinds: adaptive, with a secure basis in an unalterable social principle, and constant change only in the circumstances and machinery of its application to suit fresh ideas and fresh needs, or else radical, with no long secure basis, but instead a constant root questioning of the practical foundations and even the central principle of the established society. The modern age has resolved itself into a constant series of radical progressions. This series seems to follow always a typical course: first, a luminous seed time, and a period of enthusiastic effort and battle; next, a partial victory and achievement, and a brief era of possession; then disillusionment, and the birth of a new idea and endeavor. A principle of society is put forward by the thinker, seizes on the general mind, and becomes a social gospel, brought immediately or by rapid stages into practice. It dethrones the preceding principle and takes its place as the foundation of the community's social or political life. This victory won, men live for a time in the enthusiasm, or, when the enthusiasm sinks, in the habit of their great achievement. After a little, they begin to feel less at ease with the first results, and are moved to adapt, to alter constantly, to develop more or less restlessly the new system, for it is the very nature of the reason to observe, to be open to novel ideas, to respond quickly to new needs and possibilities, and not to repose always in the unquestioning acceptance of every habit and old association. Still, men do not yet think of questioning their social principle, or imagine that it will ever need alteration, but are intent only to perfect its forms and make its application more thorough, its execution more sincere and effective. A time, however, arrives when the reason becomes dissatisfied, and sees that it is only erecting a mass of new conventions, and that there has been no satisfying change. There has been a shifting of stresses, but the society is not appreciably nearer to perfection. The opposition of the few thinkers who have already, perhaps almost from the first, started to question the sufficiency of the social principle, makes itself felt and is accepted by increasing numbers. There is a movement of revolt, and the society starts on the familiar round to a new radical progression, a new revolution, the reign of a more advanced social principle. This process has to continue until the reason can find a principle of society, or else a combination and adjustment of several principles which will satisfy it. The question is whether it will ever be satisfied or can ever rest from questioning the foundation of established things, unless indeed it sinks back into a sleep of tradition and convention, or else goes forward by a great awakening to the reign of a higher spirit than its own, and opens into a supra-rational or spiritual age of mankind. If we may judge from the modern movement, the progress of the reason as a social renovator and creator, if not interrupted in its course, would be destined to pass through three successive stages, which are the very logic of its growth. The first, individualistic and increasingly democratic, with liberty for its principle. The second, socialistic, in the end, perhaps a governmental communism, with equality and the state for its principle. The third, if that ever gets beyond the stage of theory, anarchistic, in the higher sense of that much abused word, either a loose, voluntary cooperation or a free communalism with brotherhood or comradeship and not government for its principle. It is in the transition to its third and consummating stage, if or whenever that comes, that the power and sufficiency of the reason will be tested. It will then be seen whether the reason can really be the master of our nature, solve the problems of our interrelated and conflicting egoisms, and bring about within itself a perfect principle of society, or must give way to a higher guide. For till this third stage has its trial, it is force that in the last resort really governs. Reason only gives to force the plan of its action and a system to administer. We have already seen that it is individualism which opens the way to the age of reason, and that individualism gets its impulse and its chance of development because it follows upon an age of dominant conventionalism. It is not that in the pre-individualistic, pre-rational ages there were no thinkers upon society and the communal life of man, but they did not think in the characteristic method of the logical reason, critical, all-observing, all-questioning, and did not proceed on the constructive side by the carefully mechanizing methods of the highly rationalized intelligence, when it passes from the reasoned perception of a truth to the endeavor after its pure, perfect, and universal orderly application. Their thought and their building of life were much less logical than spontaneously intelligent, organic, and intuitive. Always they looked upon life as it was, and sought to know its secret by keen discernment, intuition, and insight. Symbols embodying the actual and ideal truth of life and being, types setting them in an arrangement and psychological order, institutions giving them a material fixity in their effectuation by life. This was the form in which they shaped their attempt to understand and mentalize life, to govern life by mind, but mind in its spontaneously intuitive or its reflectively seeing movements before they have been fixed into the geometrical patterns of the logical intelligence. But reason seeks to understand and interpret life by one kind of symbol only, the idea. It generalizes the facts of life according to its own strongly cut ideative conceptions, so that it may be able to master and arrange them. And having hold of an idea, it looks for its largest general application. And in order that these ideas may not be a mere abstraction, divorced from the realized or realizable truth of things, it has to be constantly comparing them with facts. It has to be always questioning facts, so that it may find the ideas by which they can be more and more adequately explained, ordered, and managed. And it has always to be questioning ideas in order, first, to see whether they square with actual facts, and secondly, whether there are not new facts to suit which they must be modified or enlarged, or which can be evolved out of them. For reason lives not only in actual facts, but in possibilities, not only in realized truths, but in ideal truths. And the ideal truth once seen, the impulse of the idealizing intelligence, is to see too whether it cannot be turned into a fact, cannot be immediately or rapidly realized in life. It is by this inherent characteristic that the age of reason must always be an age of progress. So long as the old method of mentalizing life served its purpose, there was no necessity for men in the mass to think out their way of life by the aid of the reason. But the old method ceased to serve its purpose as soon as the symbols, types, institutions it created became conventions, so imprisoning truth that there was no longer a force of insight sufficient to deliver the hidden reality from its artificial coatings. Man may, for a time, for a long time even, live by the mere tradition of things, whose reality he has lost, but not permanently. The necessity of questioning all his conventions and traditions arises. And by that necessity, reason gets her first real chance of an entire self-development. Reason can accept no tradition merely for the sake of its antiquity or its past greatness. It has to ask first whether the tradition contains at all any still living truth, and secondly, whether it contains the best truth available to man for the government of his life. Reason can accept no convention merely because men are agreed upon it. It has to ask whether they are right in their agreement, whether it is not an inert and false acquiescence. Reason cannot accept any institution merely because it serves some purpose of life. It has to ask whether there are not greater and better purposes which can be best served by new institutions. There arises the necessity of a universal questioning, and from that necessity arises the idea that society can only be perfected by the universal application of the rational intelligence to the whole of life, to its principle as to its details, to its machinery, and to the powers that drive the machine. The reason which is to be universally applied cannot be the reason of a ruling class, for in the present imperfection of the human race, that always means, in practice, the fettering and misapplication of reason, degraded into a servant of power to maintain the privileges of the ruling class and justify the existing order. It cannot be the reason of a few preeminent thinkers. For if the mass is infrarational, the application of their ideas becomes in practice disfigured, ineffective, incomplete, speedily altered into mere form and convention. It must be the reason of each and all, seeking for a basis of agreement. Hence arises the principle of individualistic democracy, that the reason and will of every individual in the society must be allowed to count equally with the reason and will of every other in determining its government, in selecting the essential basis, and in arranging the detailed ordering of the common life. This must be, not because the reason of one man is as good as the reason of any other, but because otherwise we get back inevitably to the rule of a predominant class, which, however modified, by being obliged to consider to some extent the opinion of the ruled, must exhibit always the irrational vice of reason subordinated to the purposes of power, and not flexibly used for its own proper and ideal ends. Secondly, each individual must be allowed to govern his life according to the dictates of his own reason and will, so far as that can be done without impinging on the same right in others. This is a necessary corollary of the primary principle on which the age of reason founds its initial movement. It is sufficient for the first purposes of the rational age that each man should be supposed to have sufficient intelligence to understand views which are presented and explained to him, to consider the opinions of his fellows, and to form, in consultation with them, his own judgment. His individual judgment so formed, and by one device or another made effective, is the share he contributes to the building of the total common judgment by which society must be ruled. His little brick, in appearance insignificant, and yet indispensable to the imposing whole. And it is sufficient also for the first ideal of the rational age that this common judgment should be effectively organized only for the indispensable common ends of the society, while in all else men must be left free to govern their own life according to their own reason and will, and find freely its best possible natural adjustment with the lives of others. In this way, by the practice of the free use of reason, men can grow into rational beings, and learn to live by the common agreement, a liberal, a vigorous, a natural, and yet rationalized existence. In practice, it is found that these ideas will not hold for a long time, for the ordinary man is not yet a rational being. Emerging from a long, infrarational past, he is naturally able to form a reasonable judgment, but thinks either according to his own interests, impulses, and prejudices, or else according to the ideas of others, more active in intelligence or swift in action, who are able, by some means, to establish an influence over his mind. Secondly, he does not yet use his reason in order to come to an agreement with his fellows, but rather to enforce his own opinions by struggle and conflict with the opinions of others. Exceptionally, he may utilize his reason for the pursuit of truth, but normally it serves for the justification of his impulses, prejudices, and interests. And it is these that determine, or at least quite discolor and disfigure his ideals, even when he has learned at all to have ideals. Finally, he does not use his freedom to arrive at a rational adjustment of his life with the life of others. His natural tendency is to enforce the aims of his life, even at the expense of, or, as it is euphemistically put, in competition with the life of others. There comes thus to be a wide gulf between the ideal and the first results of its practice. There is here a disparity between fact and idea that must lead to inevitable disillusionment and failure. The individualistic democratic ideal brings us at first, in actual practice, to the more and more precarious rule of a dominant class in the name of democracy over the ignorant, numerous, and less fortunate mass. Secondly, since the ideal of freedom and equality is abroad, and cannot any longer be stifled, it must lead to the increasing effort of the exploited masses to assert their downtrodden right and to turn, if they can, this pseudo-democratic falsehood into the real democratic truth, therefore to a war of classes. Thirdly, it develops inevitably, as part of its process, a perpetual strife of parties, at first few and simple in composition, but afterwards, as at the present time, an impotent and sterilizing chaos of names, labels, programs, war cries. All lift the banner of conflicting ideas or ideals, but all are really fighting out under that flag a battle of conflicting interests. Finally, individualistic democratic freedom results fatally in an increasing stress of competition, which replaces the ordered tyrannies of the infrarational periods of humanity by a sort of ordered conflict. And this conflict ends in the survival not of the spiritually, rationally, or physically fit, but of the most fortunate and vitally successful. It is evident enough that, whatever else it may be, this is not a rational order of society. It is not at all the perfection which the individualistic reason of man had contemplated as its ideal, or set out to accomplish. The natural remedy for the first defects of the individualistic theory in practice would seem to be education. For if man is not by nature, we may hope at least that he can be made by education and training something like a rational being. Universal education, therefore, is the inevitable second step of the democratic movement in its attempt to rationalize human society. But a rational education means necessarily three things. First, to teach men how to observe and know rightly the facts on which they have to form a judgment. Secondly, to train them to think fruitfully and soundly. Thirdly, to fit them to use their knowledge and their thought effectively for their own and the common good. Capacity of observation and knowledge, capacity of intelligence and judgment, capacity of action and high character are required for the citizenship of a rational order of society. A general deficiency in any of these difficult requisites is a sure source of failure. Unfortunately, even if we suppose that any training made available to the millions can ever be of this rare character, the actual education given in the most advanced countries has not had the least relation to these necessities. And just as the first defects and failures of democracy have given occasion to the enemy to blaspheme and to vaunt the superiority or even the quite imaginary perfection of the ideal past, so also the first defects of its great remedy, education, have led many superior minds to deny the efficacy of education and its power to transform the human mind, and driven them to condemn the democratic ideal as an exploded fiction. Democracy and its panacea of education and freedom have certainly done something for the race. To begin with, the people are, for the first time in the historical period of history, erect, active, and alive, and where there is life, there is always a hope of better things. Again, some kind of knowledge, and with it some kind of active intelligence based on knowledge and strengthened by the habit of being called on to judge and decide between conflicting issues and opinions in all sorts of matters, have been much more generalized than was formerly possible. Men are being progressively trained to use their minds, to apply intelligence to life, and that is a great gain. If they have not yet learned to think for themselves, or to think soundly, clearly, and rightly, they are at least more able now to choose with some kind of initial intelligence. However imperfect as yet it may be, the thought they shall accept, and the rule they shall follow. Equal educational equipment and equal opportunity of life have by no means been acquired. But there is a much greater equalization than was at all possible in former states of society. But here a new and enormous defect has revealed itself, which is proving fatal to the social idea which engendered it. For given even perfect equality of educational and other opportunity, and that does not yet really exist, and cannot in the individualistic state of society, to what purpose or in what manner is the opportunity likely to be used? Man, the half infrarational being, demands three things for his satisfaction: power, if he can have it, but at any rate the use and reward of his faculties, and the enjoyment of his desires. In the old societies, the possibility of these could be secured by him to a certain extent according to his birth, his fixed status, and the use of his capacity within the limits of his hereditary status. That basis once removed, and no proper substitute provided, the same ends can only be secured by success in a scramble for the one power left, the power of wealth. Accordingly, instead of a harmoniously ordered society, there has been developed a huge, organized, competitive system, a frantically rapid and one-sided development of industrialism, and, under the garb of democracy, an increasing plutocratic tendency that shocks by its ostentatious grossness and the magnitudes of its gulfs and distances. These have been the last results of the individualistic ideal and its democratic machinery, the initial bankruptcies of the rational age.